Good afternoon, board members. My name is Heather Currey. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss our current challenge here at Locus. Not only do we acknowledge the low employee retention here at Locus, but have been made aware during recent exit interviews that lack of work-life balance for our employees is to blame. Since being made aware, leadership here at Locus began to question just what could help promote more work-life balance. As a result, I was asked to research the notion of flexible work arrangements and if it could be in Locus's best interest to implement such an option. So, our agenda today, ladies and gentlemen, is to share my recommendation. That recommendation is based on review and evaluation of two related articles. For the purpose of this presentation, I'll refer to them as flexible working and employee well-being. Once I've had an opportunity to review the articles with you, I'll share the evaluation tool that I use to evaluate the articles, then share the individual evaluations. I'll then review remaining questions that I believe leadership will want to spend time thinking about. I'll then circle back to revisit my recommendations and discuss related, recommended next steps for Locus leadership. First, my recommendation. I believe Locus should, in fact, start a flexible working arrangement program. I suggest that this program be pilot in nature, that we limit it to one department for positions where flexible work arrangements do not impede the completion of a job. I recommend that we limit the trial to a 3-month period and reassess after the trial period ends. Finally, in order to effectively measure potential successes with the program, I suggest that flexible working arrangements, the performance measures, are in place at the time of the start of the trial period. This will also help to ensure that we are being transparent with our employees on expectations associated with the trial program. Let me share the evidence that helped me reach that conclusion. The first article, Flexible Work Arrangements, a systematic review aimed to review the literature on the link between flexible work arrangements, being the independent variable, and the performance-related outcomes, being the dependent variable. There were 28 articles included in the review that focused specifically on turnover and retention associated with flexible working arrangements. The study established 3 primary areas of interest. Those include flexible working arrangements, work-related outcomes, and employee outcomes. The review found that there were suggested positive associations with flexible work arrangements and work-related and employee outcomes. Further, the review notes that there are also studies that show either no association or negative association. That said, the overall findings for the study was inconclusive. I'd like to review some highlights and or takeaways from the flexible working article. First, the review highlights that family-friendly policies, including flexible working arrangements, seem to positively influence employee commitment. Next, findings suggest a potential for future consensus on a positive association between flexible working arrangements and employee attitudinal outcomes. The review notes that where there are high perceived options of flexible working arrangements, it is associated with greater organizational commitment and job satisfaction. Lastly, the review noted that there are other contributing factors to employee perception of work-life balance and employee satisfaction beyond flexible working arrangements. The second article, Employee Well-Being, is also a systematic review, reviewing quantitative studies only. This review examined if mutual gains or conflicting outcomes is more appropriate for describing employee well-being, as well as examining whether study attributes, measure of key variables, level of analysis, and study design affect the study's outcomes. While this study was a little tricky to follow, it does seem to have many tentacles. But most simply put, the independent variable was human resource management, and the dependent variable was employee well-being. The study reviewed 3 areas of well-being: happiness, including sub-areas of commitment and satisfaction, relationship, or rather between the relationship between the employee and the employer, and health, or those stressors and strain of the work environment. The overall findings of this review was that well-being in terms of happiness and relationship is congruent with organizational performance, but that health-related well-being appears to function as a conflicting outcome. A few highlights from the employee well-being article include first, that human resource management had a positive effect on employee well-being in nearly 70% of the assessed data points. There is a noted positive relationship between high performance, high committed, or high involvement work systems and organizational performance. Last, human resource management was predominantly positively associated with relational aspects of employee well-being and organizational performance. While both of these reviews sound like they could be relevant to our situation here at Locus, it is important that they're assessed for both rigor and transparency. To help me do that, I use two of the more common evaluation tools: the weight of evidence framework with what is referred to as TPUPAs. TPUPAs measures transparency, accuracy, purposivity, utility, propriety, accessibility, and specificity. According to Go, a weight of evidence framework assists researchers in making separate judgments on different generic and review-specific criteria, then combining them with an overall judgment concerning what a study contributes to answering a review question. Weight of evidence A represents a generic and thus non-review specific judgment about the coherence and integrity of the evidence in its own terms. Within this category, we assess for transparency, accuracy, accessibility, and specificity. Weight of evidence B represents the assessment of the fit for purpose, or the purposivity, of the form of evidence. Weight of evidence C represents a review-specific judgment about the relevance of the focus of evidence for the review question. Within the group, I'll assess for utility if the research provides relevant answers, and for propriety, or rather its legal and ethical merit. When evaluating the articles, I'll respond to each measure with a 1 if the measure exists. If it does not exist, or I am unable to clearly determine so, I'll score that measure with a 0. When evaluating the flexible working article, the evaluation scored a 6 out of a possible 7 points. Let me explain. Dominguez and Kelleher provided a transparent review based on a clear objective and purpose. The review was found to be accurate. Dominguez and Kelleher were informative, nearly to a detriment of the review, clearly communicating to the reader that their study was inconclusive and cited a number of limitations associated with their review. The review was accessible, as I was able to easily follow the study. The review also gained a point for specificity, as the authors were well spoken about the topic and related resources. The article gained a point for purposivity, as the review intended to review literature regarding the link between flexible working arrangements and performance-related outcomes. The review did just that. Therefore, the article meets the weight of evidence for categories A and B. While the article does discuss and lend focus to employee turnover and retention, it's not its primary focus. Because I do not give partial points, I do not believe it was appropriate to assign a point to the utility category. Lastly, the review exhibited legal and ethical research, and therefore I assigned a point to that category. Therefore, the article meets the weight of evidence for propriety, but not entirely for utility. In noting the author's assumptions and preconceived notions, Dominguez and Kelleher assumed a relationship between time of implementation or use of flexible working arrangements and any potential implementation. In addition, it was assumed that indirect effects of flexible working assignment organizational policies via employee-related outcomes on organizational performance needs further examination. When evaluating the article Employee Well-Being, the article scored 3 out of 7. The review in the onset is not well defined. I had a difficult time discerning the actual objective for the review, as it seemed to have too many aims. I therefore chose not to give the transparency measure a point. I did assign the accuracy measure a point, as there was no indication that there was inaccurate information. The review overall was challenging to follow. As a reader, I was not sure if I should be paying attention to the impacts of human resource management on employee well-being, or if I should focus on the competing priority of the discussion regarding mutual gains versus conflicting outcomes. Therefore, I gave both measures, accessibility and specificity, a 0 score. Given that only 1 out of the 4 measures of the weight of evidence A grouping received a point, I recommend that the employee well-being article does not meet the category criteria. While the weight of evidence category B was met, it is again unclear if the weight of evidence C category is met, as utility did not receive a point, largely due to the convoluted nature of the review. The author's assumptions were not well established. An overall limitation which may have lent itself to the lack of specificity associated with the review. The review included studies designed for other purposes to maximize the number of articles to be included in the review itself. Having heard the supporting evidence, I hope that the previously stated recommendations make sense, that we implement a pilot flexible working arrangement program within the aforementioned guidelines. There are a number of questions remaining associated with this topic. First, while the flexible working review did indicate positive links between flexible working assignments and performance-related outcomes, there are other options to consider for enhancing work-life balance here at Locus. Next, in consideration of the employee well-being article, how can we enhance engagement from the Human Resource Department to help support employee relations? Then, assuming we move forward with flexible working arrangements, what impacts will that have to Locus as an organization? To what extent can Locus support flexible working arrangements with regards to specific positions and departments? And what types of flexible work arrangements are we willing to consider? Last but certainly not least, is Locus technologically prepared to support flexible work arrangements? To help provide answers to a number of the previously mentioned questions, I recommend the next steps. First, leadership should define the types of flexible work arrangements that Locus is willing to consider. Should a single day of telecommuting be considered? Flexible working shifts? Partial days in the office and partial days telecommuting? Next, leadership should identify by department and position what will be appropriate for flexible working arrangements. Then, in coordination with human resources, identify performance measures associated with working flexible work arrangements. We'll want to also work with IT to ensure technological support for flexible working arrangements. Finally, I recommend that we don't limit our focus on flexible work arrangements as a solution for improving employee work-life balance here at Locus, but instead allow for subsequent review of employee satisfaction with work-life balance being the primary focus. I thank you for your time. Please see the references leveraged in this presentation. Since we do not have time to entertain questions, I ask that you send any follow-up questions or concerns to hcurry@locus.com.